The wind tore across the open plain like it had teeth. Dust slammed against the windows of the rattling stagecoach, slipping through every crack and seam. Inside the coach, Clara May Whitmore held her hat with trembling fingers while the wheels bounced over the rutted road. Every jolt traveled straight through her body, shaking loose thoughts she had tried to bury. In the pocket of her coat rested a folded letter. It felt heavier with every mile. Dear Miss Whitmore, if you seek honest work and a quiet life and a man who won't demand pretense, you will find both at my ranch in Willow Creek. Jed Callahan. It was the last line that had made her answer. You don't have to pretend. She had read those words a dozen times on the long train ride west. They had felt impossible then. They still felt impossible now. The coach slowed with a loud groan of wood and iron. When it finally stopped, the driver swung open the door and cold wind rushed inside. End of the line, miss, he muttered. Willow Creek. Clara stepped down into the dirt. The world stretched wide and empty in every direction. Prairie grass rolled across the land like waves. The mountains stood far away, sharp against the sky. The air smelled of dust and sage, and something wild she had never known in Boston. A few men lingered near the small depot building. Their faces were worn by sun and wind. One of them straightened from where he leaned against a fence post. He was tall. Broad shoulders filled his worn coat. His hat cast a shadow across his eyes. Jed Callahan, the man she had agreed to marry. Clara swallowed hard. He walked toward her with slow, steady steps. The ground seemed to echo under his boots. The station master said something in greeting, but Clara barely heard it over the pounding in her chest. She gripped her suitcase like it might shield her from the world. You're Miss Whitmore, the man said. His voice was calm and quiet. It reminded her of a river moving under winter ice. Yes, she answered softly. And you're Mr. Callahan? He nodded once. Jed's fine. Silence stretched between them. The wind tugged at Clara's veil and blew strands of hair across her cheek. She felt exposed standing there beneath the wide Wyoming sky. Every mistake she had ever made felt written across her face. Jed studied her carefully. Then he spoke the words that would stay with her for the rest of her life. You don't have to pretend with me. Something inside her chest loosened. Not softer exactly, just clearer, like air finally reaching lungs that had been tight too long. Clara looked away quickly, embarrassed by the tears gathering in her eyes. I'm not pretending, she whispered. Jed tipped his hat once. Good. He took her suitcase from her hand before she could protest. The sudden loss of weight made her feel strangely unbalanced. Ranch is a few miles out, he said. Want wagons round back. They rode mostly in silence. The wagon creaked along the trail while the horses snorted and pulled against their harness. The prairie stretched endless on every side. The sky slowly turned purple as the sun sank behind them. Clara glanced sideways at Jed. His profile looked carved from stone, a square jaw covered in rough beard, eyes always focused somewhere far ahead. She wanted to ask him why he had written that letter. Wanted to explain why she had fled across the country, but the words felt too fragile to release. When the wagon finally rolled into the ranch yard, Clara saw a small house with smoke curling from the chimney. 2 barns stood nearby. The fences leaned in the wind but held firm. The place was simple, plain, but it felt alive. A woman stepped onto the porch. Her gray hair was tied in a tight bun, and flour dust covered the front of her apron. Evening, Mr. Callahan, she called, and then her eyes softened when she looked at Clara. And this must be Miss Whitmore. Clara, Jed corrected gently. This here's Doy. She keeps the place running better than I ever could. Doy smiled warmly, and reached for Clara's hand. "Welcome to Willow Creek, dear." Clara tried to smile back, though her throat burned. "Thank you. It's beautiful." Doy looked out over the land before answering. "Beautiful," she said slowly. "And unforgiving if you're not careful." Then her expression softened again. "You must be tired. Supper's ready." Inside the house was warm and comforting. A fire crackled in the hearth. The smell of stew and fresh cornbread filled the small room. Clara sat carefully at the wooden table while Doy filled bowls. Jed removed his hat and sat across from her. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "Yes." Her spoon tapped lightly against the bowl. "Farther than I ever thought I would." "Boston," he said. She nodded. "You know it?" "Only heard of it," he replied. "Too many people." She smiled faintly. "You're not wrong." Jed watched her carefully. "And you left all that behind for this?" When Clara hesitated. "I didn't have much of a choice." Her voice came out thin. "Once a woman's name is ruined back east, there isn't much left for her." The room grew quiet. Doy's spoon paused in the pot. Jed didn't react the way Clara expected. He didn't ask questions or show pity. After a long moment, he simply said, "We all got ghosts." He met her eyes calmly. "Mine don't scare easy. Yours won't either." Something fragile inside Clara loosened again. No judgment, no lecture, just acceptance. After supper, Doy showed her to a small bedroom overlooking the pasture. "You'll rest here tonight," she said kindly. "Mr. Callahan's seeing to the horses." Clara nodded. "He's quiet," Doy chuckled. "That he is. But quiet men usually mean what they say out here." Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed once the door closed. The walls creaked in the wind. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out Jed's letter. Or the paper was worn from being folded and unfolded so many times. You don't have to be perfect. You don't even have to be sure. You just have to come. Clara folded the paper again and tucked it under her pillow. Through the window, she saw Jed walking across the yard from the barn. A lantern swung gently in his hand, while the wind tugged at his coat. For the first time in months, Clara did not feel like she was running. Still, fear lingered. What if he changed his mind? What if the town learned the truth about her? What if she could never become the woman he deserved? But watching him cross the dark yard with that steady, unhurried stride, something quiet inside her whispered a different possibility. Maybe she had finally reached a place that would not throw her away. Morning came cold and bright. Clara stepped onto the porch, wrapped in a borrowed shawl. Jed stood near the wagon, tightening the harness on the horses. He looked up when he saw her. "You planning to stay a while?" he asked. She hesitated. "If you'll have me." Jed studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "We'll give it a week." "A week?" she repeated. "You see what ranch life's like," he said calmly. "After that, you decide." A test, or maybe mercy. "All right," Clara said quietly. 1 week. Jed climbed onto the wagon seat and extended his hand. "Out here," he said. "A week's plenty long to learn whether someone means to stay." Clara placed her hand in his. The prairie wind lifted her hair into the sunlight as she climbed beside him. Behind them, the road she had traveled stretched far across the open land. Ahead waited 7 days that would change everything. The next morning came bright and sharp, the kind of Wyoming morning that made the sky look endless and the air feel alive. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots moving across the wooden floor below her room. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she saw the rough wooden walls, the narrow window, and the open prairie stretching beyond it. Willow Creek. She sat up slowly and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The air was cold enough to bite at her skin. Outside, a rooster crowed like he owned the entire valley. Clara washed her face in the small basin and brushed out her tangled hair. When she looked at herself in the little mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the woman staring back. And her cheeks were pale from the journey. Her eyes still held the shadow of too many sleepless nights. But there was something new there, too. A small spark of courage. Downstairs, Doy stood at the stove, flipping biscuits in a cast-iron pan. The kitchen smelled warm and comforting. Jed sat at the table already dressed for work. His hat rested on the chair beside him, and steam rose from the coffee mug in his hand. He glanced up when Clara entered. "Morning." "Morning," she replied softly. Doy turned with a smile. "Hope you slept all right, dear." "I did," Clara said. "Thank you." Jed tore a piece of bread and chewed thoughtfully. "You'll get used to the sounds out here," he said. "The wind, the coyotes. It never gets quiet. It just changes what kind of noise it makes." Clara managed a small smile. "I think I prefer that." Doy placed a plate of eggs and biscuits in front of her. "Best eat while it's hot, mister. Callahan here works folks harder than a mule before lunchtime." Jed didn't react to the teasing. "She's got 1 week," he said simply. Clara looked up from her plate. 1 week to see if she likes the life." Doy chuckled. "That's what he said about the last horse he tried to train." Jed's mouth twitched slightly. "We'll start simple," he said, looking at Clara. "How simple?" she asked carefully. "Fence line." Clara nearly choked on her biscuit. But the morning sun climbed higher as they rode out to the north field. Jed walked beside her carrying a hammer and a coil of wire. The land stretched wide and open around them. Tall grass moved in the wind like waves across the prairie. Jed pointed toward a leaning fence post. "Hold that steady." Clara braced the post with both hands while he swung the hammer. The nail sank deep into the wood with a clean crack. The rhythm of his work was steady and practiced. After several minutes, Clara finally spoke. "Do you ever talk while you work?" Jed glanced at her. "Only if there's something worth saying." She bit back a smile. "And what counts as worth saying?" Truth. The word struck her harder than she expected. Truth had ruined her life once. Back in Boston, truth had turned whispers into accusations and turned friends into strangers. They worked for a while in silence. Clara's hands quickly grew sore. Her palms burned from gripping the rough wood. Still, she refused to complain. Eventually, Jed handed her the hammer. "Try." She lifted it awkwardly and swung, and the hammer missed the nail completely and smacked into the post. Jed didn't laugh. He stepped behind her and gently adjusted her grip. "Like this," he said quietly. His hands were warm and steady, guiding hers. "Let the weight do the work." Clara swung again. The nail drove straight into the wood. Her heart pounded harder than the hammer. Jed stepped back. "You learn fast." She wiped sweat from her forehead. I had a good teacher." They worked another hour before stopping beside a small creek. Jed filled a tin cup with water and handed it to her. "You're tougher than you look," he said. Clara drank deeply before answering. "And you're quieter than anyone I've ever met." "Quiet's easier," he said. "Why?" "People fill silence with lies." She studied him carefully. "Do you think I'm lying to you?" Jed met her gaze. "No." He paused. "But I think you've had to lie to survive." Clara looked down at the creek water sliding over the rocks. He was right. She had lied about being fine. Lied about forgetting. Lied about not caring what people thought. "You don't know me," she whispered. Jed shrugged slightly. No, but I know the look of someone running from ghosts. His voice softened. Truth doesn't scare me, Clara. I've lived through worse. She swallowed. Maybe someday I'll tell you. Jed nodded. You'll know when you're ready. That evening, Clara sat near the fire while Doy washed dishes at the sink. Outside, Jed paced slowly across the porch boards. He's not a hard man, Doy said quietly. Just one who's seen too much. Clara nodded. He's kind, though. Most folks don't notice that right away, Doy said. Clara hesitated before asking another question. Why did he write that letter? Doy paused with her hands in the dishwater. He told me he wasn't looking for pretty words. She dried her hands slowly. He wanted someone who could stand the wind without breaking. Clara felt her throat tighten. Maybe he made a mistake choosing me. Doy laughed softly. Honey, every good thing starts with a mistake. The door opened, and Jed stepped back inside. Storm coming tomorrow, he said. Clara looked up at him. Do you ever rest? Sometimes, he replied. But I'm not good at it. She smiled slightly. Neither am I. Jed studied her for a moment. Then we'll both have to learn. The next morning, the wind arrived before the sun. Clara wrapped a scarf around her neck as she stepped onto the porch. Frost coated the ground like thin glass. Jed stood near the barn preparing the wagon. Cold one, he said. Clara climbed onto the seat beside him. Where are we going today? South Fence, she sighed. I suppose I'll be helping again. You said you were staying the week. The wagon rattled along the trail as the land rolled by in long waves of grass. When they reached the broken fence line, Jed climbed down and handed her the wire spool. You hold that. She crouched beside the post while he dug a new hole. The work was harder than anything she had done in her life. At one point, she tripped and fell straight into the mud. A loud laugh echoed behind her. Clara turned to see a young ranch hand sitting on a horse nearby. You all right there, Miss Clara? He called with a grin. Just testing the ground. Jed handed her a rag. You get used to falling, he said calmly. As long as you get back up. The young man jumped off his horse. Name's Elias, he said. Been working here 2 years. Clara brushed mud from her coat. Nice to meet you. Elias looked between her and Jed with amusement. You putting her to work already, boss? She volunteered, Jed replied. Clara lifted her chin. I'm perfectly capable. Elias raised his hands. I believe you. By the time the sun dipped low, they had repaired half the fence. Clara's hands were blistered. Her back ached. Her boots were caked with mud. But she had done it. That evening, Doy rubbed a warm salve into Clara's raw palms. You don't have to prove yourself in one day, she said. I just wanted to show I belong here, Clara admitted. Doy smiled gently. You belong because you came. Later, Clara stepped onto the porch where Jed leaned against the railing, watching the dark fields. You did good today, he said. I was a mess, she replied. You didn't quit. She studied him carefully. Why do you care if I quit? Jed didn't answer right away. Finally, he said quietly, because I know what quitting looks like. The wind moved across the prairie in long whispers. Clara stood beside him, staring into the darkness. You ever think about leaving this place? Jed shook his head. Left enough already. She nodded slowly. I think I needed somewhere that holds me still. Jed looked at her. Then stay longer than a week. Clara met his eyes. I might. The days after that conversation changed something between them. Clara noticed it first in the quiet moments. Jed still rose before sunrise, but he still walked the fence lines and checked the horses before most people even opened their eyes. But now, when Clara stepped outside, he no longer seemed surprised to see her beside him. Instead, he simply handed her a bucket or a rope and continued working. The first week passed faster than Clara expected. She fed the chickens in the mornings and gathered eggs while the sun climbed slowly over the hills. She helped Doy cook meals and learned how to stretch a stew across 2 days without wasting a single ingredient. By afternoon, she was usually outside again, learning the rhythm of ranch life. Her hands blistered and cracked. Her shoulders ached. Her boots filled with dust. But something inside her chest felt stronger with every passing day. One evening, after a long day of hauling feed to the barn, Clara sat on the porch steps watching the sky fade into purple. Jed walked across the yard carrying a saddle. He stopped when he noticed her staring out across the fields. "You thinking about leaving?" he asked quietly. Clara shook her head. "No." Jed set the saddle down and leaned against the porch rail. "You finished your week," he said. She looked up at him. "I know." Silence stretched between them. The prairie wind moved through the tall grass like a soft whisper. Jed rubbed the back of his neck, at something Clara had noticed he did when he was thinking hard about what to say. "You planning to stay longer?" Clara looked out at the land, the wide sky, the barns, the small house with smoke rising from the chimney, a place that had begun to feel less like a stranger's ranch and more like something she could belong to. "Yes," she said softly. Jed nodded once. "Good." The next morning came with clear skies and warm sunlight. But Clara was hanging laundry beside Doy when Jed walked out of the barn. He looked different somehow. Not nervous exactly, but focused. "Clara," he said. She turned toward him. "Yes?" Jed walked across the yard slowly. "I've got something to say," he said, "and I'm not a man who likes repeating himself." Clara felt her heart begin to race. He stopped a few steps away from her. "I've watched you these past days," he continued. "Watched you fall in the mud. I watched you swing a hammer like it was twice your size." Clara laughed nervously. "I remember." Jed stepped closer. "I've watched you keep going even when things were hard." He paused before continuing. "And I've realized something." Clara held her breath. "It isn't about where you came from," he said. "It's about what we build from here." He reached out and took her hand. His rough fingers wrapped around hers gently. "I don't care about your past." "Clara." Her eyes filled with tears. "All I care about is whether you'll stand beside me." The wind rustled through the cottonwood trees. Clara's voice trembled. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Jed nodded once. "Yes." Her heart pounded. She had traveled across the country to escape shame and judgment. She had expected suspicion, distance, cold politeness. Instead, she had found a quiet man who asked for nothing but honesty. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The wedding happened that same afternoon. There were no fancy decorations or large crowds, just 4 people standing beneath the cottonwood trees in the front yard. Clara, Jed, Doy, and Elias, who arrived wearing his best vest and looking far more serious than usual. Doy held a worn Bible in her hands. Jed wore his cleanest shirt and polished boots. Clara had pinned her hair back with a ribbon, Doy found in an old sewing box. When the moment came for vows, Jed cleared his throat. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, "but I promise you this." He looked straight into Clara's eyes. "You'll never have to pretend with me." Clara smiled through tears. "And I promise," she said, "to stay." Doy closed the Bible with a soft smile. "Well then," she said, "I believe that makes you husband and wife." Elias tipped his hat. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Jed Callahan finally got himself married. They celebrated with stew and cornbread under the trees. The meal was simple, but Clara had never felt more at home in her life. Later that evening, she unpacked the last of her belongings in the bedroom upstairs, her dresses folded neatly into the drawers, her journal placed beside the bed. Jed's letter rested on the nightstand. It was no longer a lifeline. Now it was a memory. And she stepped outside onto the porch, where Jed sat in a wooden chair watching the sunset. He handed her a mug of tea without saying a word. The sky glowed orange and gold across the prairie. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't answered your letter?" Clara asked. Jed leaned back in his chair. "Sometimes." "And?" He shrugged. "I'd still be here." Clara smiled. "And I'd still be running." Jed glanced at her. "You're not running anymore." "No," she said softly. "No, I'm not." Weeks passed. Clara learned every corner of the ranch. She fed the livestock in the mornings, helped mend fences, cooked meals beside Doy. In the evenings, she sat on the porch with Jed watching the sky change colors over the hills. One quiet night, Jed handed her a small wooden box. "What's this?" she asked. "Found it in the attic," he said. Clara opened the lid. Inside were a few old keepsakes, a faded photograph, a coin, an embroidered handkerchief. "Not you can keep your things in it," Jed said. She touched the photo carefully. "Your brother?" she asked. Jed nodded. "Matthew." "What happened to him?" "Fever during the war," Jed said quietly. Clara closed the box gently. "I'm sorry." Jed didn't reply, but he reached for her hand and held it. Months passed. The ranch settled into a rhythm. Clara's laughter came easier now. Her steps were stronger. One morning, while helping Doy in the kitchen, Clara suddenly felt the room spin. She grabbed the table for support. "You all right?" Doy asked. Clara nodded slowly. "Just dizzy." Doy watched her carefully. "You been feeling sick lately?" "Sometimes." "And tired?" Clara hesitated. "Yes." Doy smiled knowingly. "When was your last cycle?" Clara's eyes widened. "Oh." The realization settled slowly. That night she lay beside Jed, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing. Her hand rested lightly against her stomach. The next morning she found him outside near the barn. "Jed," she said softly. He turned toward her. "What's wrong?" Clara took a deep breath. "I think we're going to have a baby." Jed stood completely still. "You sure?" "Not yet," she admitted, "but Doy thinks so." Jed stepped closer. "How do you feel about it?" Clara placed his hand gently over her stomach. "Like we're building something." Jed exhaled slowly. "Then we'll build it right." Winter came early that year, and the first snow fell quietly across the ranch. Days grew colder. The wind howled across the prairie. One afternoon, a terrible storm rolled across the valley. Rain poured down in sheets. The creek overflowed its banks. Jed rode out with Elias to move the cattle to higher ground before the flood could trap them. Clara waited by the window all afternoon. The storm raged harder with every passing hour. By sunset, she could barely see the barn through the rain. Finally, she heard hooves outside. She rushed to the door. Jed stumbled inside, soaked and exhausted. Clara threw her arms around him. "You could have died out there," she whispered. Jed smiled weakly. "But I didn't." They sat together by the fire while Doy wrapped blankets around him. Later that night, Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "You always try to carry everything yourself," she said. Jed stared into the flames. "I'm used to it." "You don't have to anymore," she said softly. Weeks passed. The storm damage slowly faded as spring returned to the land. Grass grew again. The creek settled back into its banks. Then, one warm afternoon, Clara felt a small movement inside her belly. She gasped. Jed looked up from repairing the fence. "What is it?" "The baby," she said breathlessly. "I think it just kicked." Jed walked over and placed his hand gently against her stomach. After a moment, his eyes widened. "There it is," Clara laughed through tears. "It's real." Months later, after another long storm had passed, Clara felt a sharp pain while standing on the porch. Doy looked up immediately. "It's time," she said calmly. Jed nearly tripped over himself, rushing across the room. The fire burned bright in the hearth, while Clara labored through the night. Jed never left her side. At dawn, the cries of a newborn filled the house. Doy wrapped the baby carefully in a blanket and handed him to Clara. "A boy," she said softly. Clara held the child close against her chest. Jed leaned forward and kissed her forehead. They named him James. Not after anyone from the past, just a name that belonged to him. Life at Willow Creek continued. The fences were repaired. The fields grew green again. Clara sat on the porch most mornings with James wrapped in a quilt against her chest. She watched Jed working in the fields with Elias. The wind moved through the grass like it always had, but everything felt different now. One quiet evening, Clara and Jed sat together on the porch swing, while James slept between them. "You ever think about that first day?" Jed asked. "When you stepped off that stagecoach." Clara smiled. "I remember crying." "You were brave," he said. "I was terrified." Jed reached for her hand. "You didn't have to pretend." Clara looked out across the wide Wyoming hills. For the first time in her life, she truly believed it. "No," she said softly. "I never did." The porch swing creaked gently. The wind carried the sound across the open land. And somewhere out in the quiet prairie, as a woman who had once arrived in tears had finally found the place where she belonged.